we're going to do some post-processing of the models that we solved yesterday or built and solved yesterday. But we're also going to be talking about model calibration. So I think what I'm going to do probably for the first hour or so is show you how easy it is to actually post-process or rapidly post-process data using IMAT, especially because the save files isn't involved anymore. And then after that, we might jump into just a few slides just to show you a way that we could potentially extract actual seismic data from the numerical model. I'll show you how the tools that's available in IMAT to get seismicity from the model. But I'll jump into some slides just to give you a brief explanation of how the algorithm works and what we're looking for. So I've started IMAT. Again, I'm going to open my project, MyMine A, that we've been working on so far. Yesterday, we built a flag 3D project with 10 mining steps, and I actually created 2 flag 3D projects, but afterwards, I've actually gone and rebuilt it, and I've included all 21 mining steps just for the session, and I've solved through all of those. And I will actually be using this project that with the extended mining steps to post-process some of the data today. But apart from adding extra steps, there shouldn't be anything different to what we've done yesterday. So let me start. I'm going to turn on some geometries just so that we can actually see what's going on in the 3D viewer. And yep, so that's still my undercut and extraction levels, and I might just turn off the contours for those. It's better. So I've got my undercut and extraction levels. And you'll notice yesterday I mentioned that when the text of the mining sequence is highlighted in red, it means the models haven't been solved yet. When it's black, it means those models have been solved. So you can see all the texts are black now, so it's solved through the sequence. Also, we talked about the equilibrium and the initial stages. And I showed you some examples in the data file for the equilibrium run, and I explained to what that means. So just to reiterate, so we've got 21 mining sequences, but usually when we start solving our numerical models, we apply in situ stress to unmined rock, and we solve that to an equilibrium stage before we actually start making holes in the model and doing mining. So that's usually an elastic solve, just for the stresses to redistribute properly throughout the medium and get our first quasi-static equilibrium. That is represented by this run equilibrium. There's an additional solve that happens, and I call this the initial stage. This one is an elastic solve of the first mining step. And this is very useful. Let's say, for example, your model's got some plasticity and you are testing different rock mass properties for different calibrations. And so each time you change a property, you want to run through the sequence. You're not happy with the results, you change some properties again, you want to run through the sequence. What these 2 stages allow you to do is, if they exist, you do not have to rerun the equilibrium step and the initial step, because we've got an elastic solve of the quasi-static equilibrium of the first mined out step. We can simply continue with this run, and it saves an enormous amount of time, just continuing from this point rather than running through the whole sequence again. Yeah, so bear in mind, this is what these 2 steps are for. And you'll notice that you cannot expand them. You cannot add geometries to them. They are simply there as a visual indicator that these 2 stages are solved and they are available to use. All right. So usually when we solve a model through all the sequences, we want to quickly just look at the results to make sure everything makes sense, see how the stresses are redistributed throughout the medium. And The first quick and dirty way that most of us actually use in flat 3D as well is using a cut plane to view the results. So if you expand your grid, yesterday I went through all these items in here, going through all the refinements, all the different domains, the ring slots, scales, etc. But there are additional items under the grid that will be useful to just quickly visualize some of the modeling results. And the first one is the cut plane. So I'm going to turn my cut plane on. And what this does is it loads the flat 3D grid in the background. It usually takes a couple of seconds depending on the size of the model. And here we can see a cut plane. And this should look semi-familiar to all of you that work with flat 3D. Currently, I'm not visualizing any parameter. So the cut plane by default just shows you a cut plane through your model and the zone sizes. You can see I've got some coarse resolution, and then I've got some structures where I added some refinement, and then closer to my excavations, I added even 2 additional levels of refinement there. And similar to how you modify all the other spatials, you can move your mouse wheel in the controls tab, and you can move that cut plane through the medium. And again, you can change your rotation. You can move it any arbitrary rotation that you want to move through this medium. Next to the cut plane, there's a parameter. If you click on this, you can see all the different modeling parameters that you can contour. And I'm going to select Sigma 1, and you'll notice that it's still not showing anything. That's because I need to select what we call an active model, the model results that I want to view Sigma 1 on. So under project, you'll currently see this no model item here. It says I've got no model currently active. If you click on that, that will show you all the stages that have been solved. So the first one that we could potentially load is basically the pre-mining stress distribution, the equilibrium stage. So now it's loading those stresses, plastic strains, and displacement from the pre-mining stage. And I'm just plotting Sigma 1 on the cut plane. And if I look at the legend, I'm showing everything between 0 and 100 MPa, which is great. I can even set a pre-mining stage visible. Basically, this is the stress state without modeling. It's basically using this in situ stress that we've defined here and compare it to what flat 3D after it reached equilibrium, what that looks like. So that's the pre-mining stress state. Makes sense. Everything is nicely layered because we've got a vertical stress field. But after flat 3D, we entered that into flat 3D, solved it to our first equilibrium run, and this is what the stress state looks like afterwards. So we can actually see the slight bending, and this is obviously because we have boundaries in our model, and it's slightly modified. Again, it's not too bad. I'm just going to go back to the pre-mining quickly, and I want to show you some useful features on the cut plane. So currently, I'm just visualizing contours for the visible parameter Sigma 1, but you can also visualize vectors. So for example, if I want to see what the direction of the Sigma 1 is in this area, so let me just turn off my contours. So I'm not going to show any parameter, but just the vectors. And what I'll do is I'm just going to make them a little bit longer so that you can actually see something. I can see the directions of the Sigma 1 vectors and actually compare that to what the mine has provided. Now, obviously, in this case, this is the pre-mining stress state, so it should match. But if I were to go to the equilibrium run or any one of the others, then this should roughly agree, especially in the area far from mining, with what we've entered. This is basically a first quick visual check just to make sure that we've actually entered the information correctly and it agrees with what the mine has provided us or what we actually wanted to model. You can also turn on the Sigma 2 or Sigma 3 vectors or even shear stress vectors. So I'll hide Sigma 1 and just show the shear stress vector. So if this is a plane of failure, this cut plane is a plane of failure, what would the direction of slip be? in this plane. And you can see this is sort of this east-west. So looking at purely my unmined stress state, I can now go ahead and select any one of my solved models and see how that would modify, or how that changes, or changed, especially close to the excavation. So I've turned on model step 21. You can see the shear stress vectors, for example, changing here, pointing towards the excavations. If I turn on the sigma 1 vectors and see how sigma 1 actually rotates, you can actually see that here. And this is where things become really interesting. So now we've got a solved model with stress directions. Now we can actually jump ahead and look at the direction, the stress directions from the seismic data, and see how well our model agrees with those stress directions in this area. So I'm going to go ahead to my seismic data, just make sure I don't have any filters applied. I'm actually just going to apply a filter, maybe local magnitude 0.5. And just see how many focal mechanisms I have. Yep, so I've got, so I'm going to maybe move my cut plane to this area. So I've got, got more events that intersect that cut plane. So just bear with me. Great. So now I'm looking at my modeled sigma 1 vectors, and now I am going to visualize my pressure axis vectors from seismic data, and I'll keep that there. Just change the color so we can actually see the difference. So this is what the stress directions, the blue ones is the stress directions from the seismic data. The red is this model step 21 stress directions that comes from the flat 3D model. And this is a very good match, especially in this area where it intersects. You see sigma 1 moving in this direction, rotating here. The seismic data is predicting, or actually indicating, almost exactly the same thing. So this already is purely from visual inspection, gives me confidence in my model. My model results agree with what's actually happening underground. You can do the same thing for sigma 2 and sigma 3 vectors, shear stress vectors, nodal planes. You can do the same thing for nodal planes, look at the shear stress directions, see if it agrees with some of the nodal plane directions, etc. But yeah, purely by using the seismic data, I can already see that my model is, I've got some confidence in my model. So I'll turn the seismic data back off, and I will turn my contours off and maybe look at the plastic strain contours. So these are the areas for model step 21 where we had plastic strain. Or basically those zones that failed. If I turn, for example, there's underneath cut plane, there's a plastic strain option. These just indicate the zones, the centroids of the zones that actually failed. Now you'll notice on the boundaries of my excavation, this is something that I mentioned yesterday. You get this shear band on the boundaries of your excavation. For this particular model, I didn't add this elastic boundary, so that's why we've got these nasty shear bands. And usually, this isn't great. This is not something that we really want in our model. So, yeah, when I resolve this model, I should actually add the elastic band around my boundaries. Yeah, and again, you can choose any one of these modeling parameters. There's in-plane shear stress, for example, or normal stress, and displacements here as well. There's your magnitude of displacement. And again, yeah, you've got the, you can look at different legend items. Let me just click on that. Something that I briefly showed the other day is that you can actually move this legend into the 3D scene. If you want to create pictures, a nice picture for a report, you can have the legend in a 3D scene. If you hold the control button, you'll notice that the legend becomes yellow. then you can actually move it around. So you can have multiple legends in the 3D viewer. So for example, if you have contours, modeling result contours, seismic data contours, you can have multiple legends in the 3D scene, and you can then create a nice screenshot. Or if you are creating a movie, you can place that legend exactly where you want. So control and right click just hides the legend again. All right, so this is the first quick way to make sure that the modeling or the model that I've solved, what the results look like. Now, you can imagine if we have 100 or 200 mining steps to go through all these stages and all the different modeling parameters manually, it will be extremely time consuming to do this one by one. This can be quite annoying. So I'm going to show you 2 additional tricks that we can do to actually speed this up. The next one follows along the similar lines to what I'm showing here, the cut plane, but we actually have fixed geometries that we do want to contour. And then finally, I'm going to show you how to create use the movies option in your Flat 3D project that you've got here to rapidly analyze all the results or results quickly. So yeah, so I've shown the cut plane. I think that should make sense. I'm going to jump ahead and look at fixed contours. So let me enable some caves. I'm going to have a look at the cave here. Maybe just go into a plan view. So let's say, for argument's sake, I want to see over time what it looks like if the sigma 1 or the maximum principal stress in these pillars. So there's an option in your Flat 3D project, this result points option. This is where you can dump wireframes, points. There's a special option that I'm going to use now called nodes, where you can dump that information, and you can, what IMAT will do is it will use the Flat 3D model and it will interpolate results onto those points or wireframes that you've dumped in there, and you can calculate results. So the first thing that we can do is we can actually create geometries. You can also create a grid if you like, if you want to plot isosurface, but I'm going to create a geometry, call it maybe my pillars plane. So it's actually not where I want it to be. So I'm going to pick my center somewhere around there. So move my pillar up. Might actually translate it into in this direction. Maybe a little bit down because I want to get into that pillar. Yep. And there are a few different options for geometries that I can manually create. First thing I can do is create a mesh, basically a wireframe with a certain cell size, or I can create a 3D grid. So if I have a grid, you'll see that there's a Z option. So then the arrows appear here. So I'll have a full grid of isosurfaces, for example, that I can contour here. I can digitize points using the points option, or I can select nodes, and I will use the nodes option in a little while to show you what that is used for. But for this particular example, I am just going to create a mesh, and I might actually just make it slightly smaller. Let me just, and this, what I'll also do is I don't want a mesh of this full plane. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just digitize points here. I want my mesh to only be in this area here. So, and I'll make my cell size slightly smaller. Let's say I'm going to go by 2 by 2 meter cells. And if I preview, this is what my wireframe will look like. And okay, so I've just created my pillars wireframe. Now you'll notice that I've just created the geometries. It says I've no data for step 15. That means I've got step 15 active, but I haven't yet interpolated stress, plastic strains, or displacements onto this geometry. So to do that, if you added a new geometry in here, you'll just right click, calculate results. Select the model stages that you want to use to calculate the results. So I'm going to select all of them except equilibrium and initial, and select OK. This usually doesn't take too long. the first, it just needs to load all that data, and it needs to do that interpolation. So this would probably take, yeah, about a minute or so. So just bear with me. So just doing that interpolation quickly. While this is busy, what I might actually do is just digitize a node, a few nodes as well here, just to show you what that option looks like. So I'm going to right click, new geometry. Again, I need to make sure my plane is where I want it to be, because the plane is where you digitize on. So I'm going to move my center up, back up there. I'm not going to worry about shifting it too much, but I want to create, let's call this my, I'm going to pretend that there's maybe a crusher somewhere over here, which I know it's ridiculous, but let's say there's a crusher chamber somewhere over here, and I want to see, look at the stress change, maybe over time for this particular node. And I'll say, okay. So now I've created pillars option. You'll see for pillars, there's no data for step 15 option has disappeared. That means I have interpolated the results onto that, but I haven't done it for this new crusher node that I've just created. So I'm just going to do the same thing for crusher, calculate all the results for crusher. This will be quick now because most of the data should be loaded. And that's done. So it's just for all 21 steps, it's calculated those results. So let's use our pillars option first. I'll turn my pillar on. Same as the cut plane, we currently have no parameter visible. So if I select that, I can choose any modeling parameter I like. Now this part, obviously it's mined out because that's where our ring cave is for step 15. But as you move through the different steps, there's step 1 results. Maybe let's just make this contours slightly smoother. So I will use a fixed color range, let's say between 0 and 100 MPa. Oh, 100 is maybe too large. Let's try 80 MPa. And I'm going to step my color map. That makes it better. So I've got a step color map. And I think I'm happy with that. So you can now just go through step 1, step 2, step 3, 4, and go through this, all the models, to see how it changes. Again, this is time consuming, but it's already faster than using the cut plane to go through it. You can imagine if you were to have 100 mining steps to just do this, create a screenshot, change to the next model, create a screenshot. It will be slow. It's already faster than the tools that we currently have in Flag 3D to look at the change of stresses, because what you typically would have to do with Flag 3D is have a save file for each step, restore that save file, then get the results on to this plane, and then create a picture. So this is already a lot faster, but it's still too slow to do it manually. So I'll get to the movies option where you can see how we can do this very quickly. So also, I've created this crusher point. You can visualize values on this crusher point. Now it's all for step 18. It's already mined out, so I'm going to use one of the earlier stages. You can actually see there's a color. It's red. But what nodes are particularly useful for is a time plot. Actually, I shouldn't have placed my node there because I'm going to mine it out quite quickly. I'm going to place my node down, a new node down here. So that I'm mined towards it. So just bear with me. I'm going to delete this one and create a new node. New geometry. Make sure my plane is where I want it to be. Yep, that's where I want it to be. Create my new crusher node. Somewhere down here. Okay. Again, I'm going to interpolate my results onto it for all the mining stages, which is quick. It's already done. So there I've got my node. And what I might do is I'm just going to make my node slightly bigger, make it 10. There we go. You can add as many nodes as you like. You don't have to add one. You can click multiple nodes. But what's quite useful now is the time plot. So if I open up my time plot chart, and I turn on under my Flag 3D project. So this is populated now, but I'm going to use my crusher and look at, let's say, the change in sigma 1. So you can see for the first mining stages, as we mine towards the node, the average or the sigma 1 increases on that node, and then eventually it drops, probably as we start mining through it, or it enters some de-stress zone. So what is quite useful now is if I, for example, had seismic data close to this node, if I've got good seismic data, I can look at the change in sigma 1, maybe together with mined cumulative potency. Now, in this case, it doesn't make sense because I haven't even added a spatial filter to the data. But this is potentially how you could use seismic data with modeling data to see what makes sense. Oh, another one that's also quite useful with stress is a parameter called energy index, something that I haven't gone into too much detail on, but yeah, energy index is a useful parameter. So that's visualizing results on that node. I can also select the pillar, for example, that I've used. So and if I turn sigma 1 on for the pillar, you can see the decrease in sigma 1. So what this is doing is, so I've got this entire pillar here, and I'm giving you basically a single value over time for the pillar. So it's value scheme linked to this pillar that I'm currently looking at, and it's using the average of sigma 1 over time. You can use the median and the minimum and the maximum. So you can see the maximum obviously increases as we mine this pillar out. It's same story for the minimum. So if you've got more than one point, it will maybe on your wireframe, or you've got two nodes and you're plotting the results simultaneously, it will use this value scheme to get the results. Whereas my crusher, I had a single point. So maybe I'll just change the color of that point. So then it's basically just taking the value of that single point in your time plot. All right. Now, I've manually created geometries that I want to interpolate results on. But if we, for example, have structures and we want some geometries that undulates, or geometries that a mine sent us, you can dump those geometries in here as well and interpolate the results on there. So I've got a plane here, and I've got structures. So what I might do is I'm just going to copy my existing structures and dump it into the result points folder. Again, you'll notice the plane's got no data and all structures got no data for my current modeling step. So I need to right click. You can multiple select. You can create all your geometries first, multiple select, and calculate results for those mining steps. And I'll say OK. Should be a lot quicker because there is, the data is already loaded in memory. So now again, the no data option disappeared. If I turn on my plane and a parameter, let's say excess shear stress. So what I'm looking at now here is excess shear stress on my plane. Now, excess shear stress is usually a parameter that we only use with elastic models. And excess shear stress lower than 0 doesn't make sense. Now, well, in this case, it actually makes sense because we've got plasticity in our model. So theoretically, there shouldn't be any excess shear stress. But I'm going to artificially make positive ESS by reducing the friction angle to something lower than what I've used before. Even that actually didn't change it significantly. Let's just fix my color range. Say, yeah, so there's no positive ESS, which makes sense. The same for all structures. We can look at ESS on maybe all the geometries that I've created here. And this looks like a pretty picture. And obviously, it's not too useful for us for a report. But yeah, so it's just to illustrate how we can look at results. So let's make it -10 to Well, actually, I'm going to use a different parameter. I'm going to use not excess shear stress, but in maximum shear stress in plane. That makes a bit more sense. 0 to 23. So let's fix our color range 0 to 20 and step it. That makes more sense. And now the same story is with the planes or the other geometries. Currently, I'm looking at model 1 as my active model. You can change your model, active model. You can see on the structures as I monitor it how the contours vary slightly on some of these structures. But again, as I mentioned before, this is extremely time consuming, especially if you have, for example, 100 or 200 mining steps that you've solved. To do this manually one by one and create screenshots is extremely time consuming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my pillars that I've solved, and I am going to set up a movie to look at the change in sigma 1 over time for this pillar. So I'm going to just set myself up into a plan view. I'm going to create a movie maybe for this plan view for these 21 mining steps. So there's a movie option. We're going to create a new movie to look at the change in sigma 1 in this pillar for the various mining steps. Now, the movies option, you can create as many movies as you like. So I'll call this my sigma 1 on pillars movie. But imagine you've set up 100 movies, maybe different viewpoints, different geometries. You batch generate them maybe overnight before you go home, and the next morning when you get back to work, you can visualize all these movies. So yeah, you can batch generate as many movies as you like. So this particular movie, I'm going to call my sigma 1 on pillars movie. We need to choose attributes, things that we actually want to include in this movie. Well, for this particular movie, I want to add a mining sequence. I also want to add contours. I want to add contours of sigma 1, but I do not want to add seismic data for this particular movie. You can choose to add seismic data if you like. If you want to maybe set up a movie of changing excess shear stress on a structure together with seismic data, change seismic data over time for that particular structure. So, but for this particular movie, I'm not going to add seismic data. So there's my sigma 1 dash pillars movie that I've just created. You'll notice same as everything else. If the data is not available, then it's red. That means the movie hasn't been generated yet. And I also need to configure a few things. First thing I need to do is set an aspect ratio of the movie. So I've got a 1280 by 1024 movie, just the default values. If you really want a high-res movie, maybe you want to create use some of the movie screenshots in a report. You can really go high-res if you want. This movie doesn't use the 3D viewer to capture the scene. It's all generated in memory. Basically, it means generated by the CPU, and that's why we can batch process or batch generate these movies. We need to set a camera view, so you can have some view. I will maybe choose this particular view for my movie. So you will see the option camera view not set. So I'll click on that button, and it just saved my current camera view. Under my result point contours, I need to choose what geometry I'm going to use that's currently available in my result points folder. So you'll see them here. What geometry I'm going to use. I'm going to use this pillars option. What parameter we want to contour on it. So again, you can choose any one of the parameters that you want to contour. We can add transparency to it. I might fix my color range to be the same as what I see here. So I'm going to show contours between 0 and 80 MPa. You can choose your color map if you want. Choose a different one. I'm going to step my color map with 10 steps. Then I'm not going to reverse it, so I think I'm happy with that. And then for the mining sequence, there's only two options. You can add some transparency to your mining sequence, and you can choose to add or not add the cave geometry. So I will keep the cave in this movie because I'm in a plan view and the cave won't obstruct my view. But sometimes, especially if you're in some strange angle, let's say you generated your movie from this angle and the cave grows, it actually obscures the contours here. So you can actually remove it. It's just an additional feature that you can use to hide the cave geometries but show all the other geometries, just to make the movie more visible. So I've just configured my movie, so I'll right click, build my movie, and usually depending on how many mining steps you have and how many interpolation needs to get done, it can take some time. In this example, it shouldn't take too long. It's already step 18, 19, 20. So it's quite quick. Now it's encoding the images, and it's asked me, do I want to play the movie now? And I'll say yes. So this is how we can rapidly generate results. These images are available in the IMAT project for you as well. So you can, instead of creating screenshots from the movie, you can find those images in your IMAT project, and you can just grab the images from there. I'll just play this movie again, just to show you what it looks like. I should have actually moved my plane slightly lower because, yeah, there's it's just above the mining sequence, and that's why we're not seeing it. Okay, now let's say, for argument's sake, you want to create 10 or 20 different movies. You can right click, instead of setting up new movies like I just did one by one manually, you can just copy the movie and give it a new name, maybe call it Sigma 1 on my node, or excess shear stress on structure A. You'll see that it's now already pre-configured. It's just not available, so I can just go ahead, make some minor modifications, maybe change my result point contours. Maybe I'll use excess shear stress or maximum shear stress on my plane instead of my. I'll just have a look at where my plane is. So I'm going to set up let's say a view from that angle. I shouldn't have called this Sigma 1 on node because this is not what it is, but I'll use that. I'll save my current camera view. Show my mining sequence. I think that's, well, probably not 80 MPa, but 20. Let's do that, and let's compile this movie. Great, and that actually looks quite nice when you actually see the change in shear stress on that plane. So the question is, can we actually extract seismic events, like events with locations, like actual XYZ coordinates from our model, and can we correlate it to real seismicity? Now, many consultants, not necessarily us, but some others, I've seen uses parameters like plastic energy or and compare that to real seismic data to get a global estimate of the seismicity. But to date, I haven't really seen many people actually trying to model real seismic events. So what I'm going to present here is one possible way that we can get seismicity or seismic events from our numerical models. I'm not going to go into too much detail into all these slides. I'm just going to try and give you a general idea of how the algorithm that's implemented in IMAT works. Yeah, so one of the main reasons why we actually do numerical modeling is to manage seismic hazard. There are obviously other reasons as well, but to manage hazard is one of the main reasons why we do modeling. And it's, from my experience, it's usually not an important point that's really that well understood in the mining industry. As I mentioned, people try to find correlation between modeling parameters and seismicity, for example, excess shear stress on structures, and then they look at lobes of positive excess shear stress and look at maybe an event that located on the structure, and then they come to a conclusion that yes, the structure slipped. But that's not really modeling seismicity, that's trying to find some correlation. The question is, how can you actually convert any of these parameters, excess shear stress, energy release rate, or even just purely looking at sigma 1, how can you convert that into seismic events? And yeah, as I said, that's not often done. And also, can we actually get seismic events from models that's elastic? So if you have the excess shear stress parameter, that's an elastic modeling parameter, can you actually convert that into an actual seismic event? Probably the most common mistake that most modelers make is treating seismic events as dots in space. Now, I hope I've convinced you over the last 2 days, especially 2 days ago when I went over the seismicity. A seismic event is not just a dot in space. It's got an area of failure or some volume. A seismic event, by definition, as I've mentioned, is a volume of inelastic deformation. So if you have a seismic event of, let's say, magnitude 2, it's typically 200 or 300 meters area that slipped, or then simply using one dot in space to represent that seismic event is not accurate. So a seismic event is way more than just a location on your mind. They have location, but one of the more important things, they have a size, and then the most important things, they've got a mechanism of failure. So I've showed you many beach balls, source mechanisms for these events, and this is a very important part that is most of the time neglected. People don't look at the mechanism of failure. They simply look at the location, and in some instances, some consultants take the size of the event into account, but no one really looks at the mechanism. So this is just some examples. This is for a mine. There's an area of positive ESS. What people usually do is they then look at the seismicity in this area and say, oh yes, there's a correlation. There's seismic events in this area. We've got positive ESS. My model's calibrated. My model predicted that seismic event. Or this is just another example. These are actual dots in space, are seismic events, and they create contours of maybe sigma 1 in this instance. Say, yes, look at the dots in my high stress area. My model is calibrated because I've got high stress here and I've got lots of seismicity. It's calibrated. But seismic events, as we know, doesn't necessarily just occur in high stress areas. It can occur in low stress areas as well, like a cave boundary or maybe some weaker rock mass. So seismic events are not necessarily just stress related. A seismic event is a volume of sudden inelastic deformation. It's a quick process. It's a brittle process. So if you look at a typical stress strain curve, and we are climbing towards this peak, then when a seismic event occurs, we basically move quickly at our yield point from a peak to residual value. What our numerical models does, and especially with strain softening, our constitutive models that contain strain softening, the softening curve often looks like this. Whereas in reality, when we look at the seismic event, it's a brittle process. It goes quickly from some peak to residual value, and then maybe again it can accumulate some strain, and then it drops again. That each one of these processes considered to be a seismic event. Whereas, as I mentioned, yes, when we use a softening model, it often follows this process. This is not a seismic process. This slow softening is not seismic. And that sort of follows on the point that I've made earlier on 2 days ago, that our numerical models, the majority of the plasticity in our numerical models is aseismic, and it's because of this. So I know with models like IMAT, you can actually change this into a quite brittle behavior, and this is exactly what we want. But we currently have no way of excluding. So let's say, for example, we reach this point, we drop to a new residual value and then follow a different path in the softening curve. We currently have no way to exclude the rest of the softening. To model seismicity, we really only want to record this part, this brittle process here. So I hope it makes sense. What I'm trying to explain is, if we take all the plastic strain in our model, we're going to get a combination of seismic and aseismic behavior, whereas we really only want to record this brittle behavior, this initial failure. Something I also briefly touched on 2 days ago is, can we model energy? Yes, we can. Many people do it, but use it with caution. The speed at which the process happens determines the seismic energy. So it's a dynamic process. And as I mentioned, we run our flat 3D models with strong damping to reach a quasi-static equilibrium. Basically, we don't allow stress waves to propagate through our medium. We're actually throwing a lot of energy away when we damp our system. So comparing real seismic energy, and in quotes, the speed at which the process happens, with parameters such as plastic energy, is, you need to really be careful how you use that, because the two things are not necessarily the same. Seismic potency, on the other hand, can be directly correlated to plastic strain. So my recommendation is to rather use seismic potency, or try to model seismic potency and seismic energy in our quasi-static models. The method that I'm going to show you now uses plastic strain and it converts it to seismic potency, and it completely ignores energy. So seismic energy is not accounted for in this method. So how does it actually work? Let's assume we've got a numerical model. This is just a 2D model. Each of these squares represent square zones, and we've got zones that failed. These red and green zones, they failed. And there are two mechanisms of failure. Let's say some zones failed under shear, some zones failed under tension, shear and the tensile zones. How can we convert that into a seismic event? So the algorithm that I'm going to show now, it uses a double clustering algorithm. First, it tries to separate all those zones. It separates all the zones in the models that failed into their separate mechanisms. So you'll see I had two mechanisms combined in my single model. We first perform a clustering to separate them into their separate mechanisms that failed. So we get the green and red mechanism, and then we try to combine with the second spatial clustering algorithm. We combine all these zones, all these neighbor zones that failed in the same way, into a single seismic event. So rather than, for example, considering these three zones as three separate seismic events, we consider them to be one seismic event. So it's a double clustering. First, mechanism separation, and then spatial clustering to combine neighbors into a single event. If we move it to a 3D example, so assume we've got a structure, two structures. There's red structure that you can see here and a blue structure here. And all of these dots, these are zones or maybe facets, faces, interfaces that failed on these structures. So we've got one structure that failed in one way, and we've got another structure that failed in another way. So the first part is to separate them into their two separate mechanisms, and then the second is to apply a spatial clustering algorithm. So effectively, looking at this picture just from a slightly different view, we've got two groups, two mechanisms of failures, but we've got some spatial discontinuity. This gap here, these are zones that didn't fail. So the spatial clustering algorithm will cluster these zones as one event, these green ones as another event, and the third one as an event, and then the weighted, potency weighted average of these clusters becomes the centroid of the event. So two mechanisms of failure with a discontinuity got separated into three different events. Do the first clustering, basically the mechanism separation, the mechanism clustering, we use something called semblance. Semblance parameters, just one way that we can compare the similarity of two different tensors. So if two tensors, like m and n, are exactly the same, we will have a similarity of 1. If the two tensors are completely opposite, we will have a similarity of -1. So the first clustering algorithm uses this similarity measure between two plastic strain tensors, each combination of plastic strain tensors for each point of every zone that failed, to separate them into their different groups of failure. Then we apply the second clustering algorithm uses the dbScan, density-based spatial clustering, to separate those neighboring zones that failed together into a single event. So now that we've got a way to model seismic events, how can we use it to calibrate a numerical model? We as consultants get asked to do a life of mine project for the mine, and what the mine's really interested in is the future potential hazard that one specific mining sequence has. So the idea of calibration is, if a numerical model is capable of reproducing what happened in the past, that's calibration, then we can use it to forecast what may happen in the future. So our job as modelers is to try and get the model calibrated such that it reproduces events that occurred in a similar way to what we are recording. So we want our model events to produce similar results to what we are currently recording from our seismic system. And there are 4 metrics that we typically should look at when we do a calibration. The first one is, if we've got modeled seismic events and we've got real seismic data, we want a rough correlation between the location of the model events and where the recorded data is. So if we've have model events locating maybe close to a cave, we want recorded seismic data to locate there as well. So location is probably the easiest to understand. We want the model events to locate roughly where we observe them. Then, this is where things actually become more interesting. We want the total seismic potency of our model to agree with the recorded seismic data. So remember, I mentioned seismic potency is can be directly correlated to plastic strain. So effectively what I'm saying is, we want the modeled plastic strain to roughly agree with the plastic strain converted from the seismic data. Then we take it one step further. We use the potency frequency distribution, the Gutenberg-Richter plot, for our modeled events and compare it to observed seismic events. And that should agree. We basically want our model to forecast the same hazard as what we're currently observing with the real seismic data. And I'll show you what this looks like. And then the final metric is, if we've got modeled seismic events, we want the source mechanism, or the beach balls basically, of our model data to roughly agree with our observations. So this is 4 very useful metrics that we can use to determine whether a model is calibrated or not. We set up a model. We choose certain constitutive models, failure criteria. We model plasticity, solve the mining sequence, extract seismic events, compare the metrics, 4 metrics I mentioned in the previous slide, to the observed data. If the match is not ideal, then we modify the material parameters, and we repeat the entire process until we've got a good match. So I'm going to use this mine. This is an example where we will compare the 4 metrics to actual observed seismic data to determine if the model is calibrated or not. So they've provided a mining sequence starting in 2016, ending 2013. It's just colored here according to the date. And I've repeated that process previously. That I described previously. We've built a numerical model for this mining sequence. We've entered material properties, which is a constitutive model. We ran through the mining sequence, used the algorithm to extract seismic data from the model and compare it to observations. Now, the green events, the events that we see here, these are the model seismic events, and the blue events are the locations of the actual seismic data. So for this particular project, I was mostly interested in what happened underground. I wasn't really that interested in what happened around the Cape. So I really focused on getting my model calibrated in this lower area of the mine. And purely, these plots aren't ideal. A 3D view would have been better, but we can see quite a nice correlation between where the model produced seismic events and where we actually observe them. The second metric, the one that I mentioned that is really important, is the Gutenberg-Richter plot. We want the model to produce the same hazard as what we observed in this observing the seismic data. So the blue dots, this is the potency frequency distribution of the actual recorded seismic data, the real seismic data. The green dots, this is represents the seismic events that we extracted from the model. And when we do a calibration, we really want a good match here, because if we get a good match here, it means our model is capable of reproducing the same hazard level as we're currently observing. Then when we do future modeling, any change in this curve means for that particular mining sequence means either an increase or decrease in hazard. I also said one of the metrics is looking at the total seismic potency that the model produces in various areas. In this particular example, in that lower area of the mine, so the blue again is the total seismic potency for that lower area of the mine using the real seismic data, and the green is the total seismic potency from the modeled seismic events. And again, my model forecasted roughly about 600 cubic meters of seismic potency, and it agrees very well with the 600, almost, well, slightly higher than 600 cubic meters of observed seismic potency. And then finally, the fourth metric, looking at source mechanisms. Now, I've used the StereoNet plot for various areas of the mine. This is just one example. So we look at the principal axis, the PB and T axis that I've mentioned quite a few times over the last few days of the source mechanism. This is of the recorded data. We can see for that particular area, the P-axis has got this sort of northeast, southwest orientation dipping at 0. When we compare that for this area with the modeled principal axis of the source mechanisms, it agrees quite well. And the same for B, or the sigma 2 axis, it's fairly good match. And then finally sigma 3 as well. So this is a visual indicator of a visual representation of how we can actually calibrate our model. So I might just jump out of the presentation there and jump back into IMAT and show you how we can extract seismic events from our numerical model. So I'll hide my plane, and what I'm going to do is I am just going to turn my plastic strain back on to give you an indication of zones that failed in this model. Now, I actually should theoretically create a spatial filter and remove all of this plasticity, because this is going to be artificial seismic events when the algorithm extracts it from the numerical model. But for now, just for time's sake, I'm going to jump ahead and just generate seismicity using the whole model. But this is the area where we observe plasticity for step 21 in our model. So this is where I expect modeled seismic events to be. So how to do it? There's our flat 3D project. We right click and there's an option, extract events. I've tried to give a fairly decent explanation of each one of these parameters. and what they mean, but if you're more interested, you can go and read this paper that describes in a lot more detail what I've just shown you in the presentation. So what this will do is it will create a synthetic seismic data set in our seismic data plugin in IMAT. So I'm going to use this one, I call this maybe my modeled events a plugin. Oh, sorry, model events dataset. Remember, I mentioned there's a double clustering. We use the tensor similarity, that value that ranged between -1 and 1. How much, what is the threshold of similarity between two plastic strain tensors for them to be considered to be part of the same cluster? So remember, I mentioned 1 means the tensors are exactly the same, or and -1 means they're completely opposite. So usually from experience, a value between 0.7 to 0.9 is a good value to choose for the similarity. And just to quickly bring the presentation back, when you make that value lower, effectively what you do is you change the slope of your modeled hazard curve. When you make the similarity between two plastic strain tensors smaller to be considered to be part of the same event, you actually combine larger groups of mechanisms into one event. So you're actually effectively changing the slope. So this is one measure that we can do to change the slope in that potency frequency distribution. Then there's a parameter called the potency scale factor. So as I mentioned, the majority of plasticity in our numerical models are aseismic. So we can either use all the plasticity that comes from all the zones that failed and consider that to be seismic, or you've got a way to play with it, basically saying that I only consider 10% of the total plasticity for each zone to be seismic and the rest aseismic. So this is how you can scale it down. So for this particular plot, just bringing this back again, for this particular plot, if your model produces way more seismic potency than what you actually observed, you can actually scale that down using this potency scale factor. And this, yes, value between 0 and 1. Then I mentioned a few minutes ago that for our numerical models, we don't have an easy way to stop recording plasticity after we have the brittle response on the stress strain curves. So what we can do is we can either only consider new zones that fail between mining steps as areas where seismicity can occur, or we can subtract the previous mining steps plasticity to only use that part of the plastic strain tensors for each zone that failed to be considered to be seismic, or we can go ahead and just use the full tensor. From experience, though, this actually creates a lot of seismic potency in the model. So for flat 3D models, you typically do not want to use this. This option, if you only use the new failed zones, works quite well. And then finally, the energy index slope and intercept parameters. This is not too important for this algorithm, but because this algorithm is a seismic potency-based method, it produces events with seismic potency, but we've got no way to actually get full magnitude from the seismic potency unless you're using the Hanks-Kanamori magnitude scale. But if you choose an energy index slope and intercept that agrees with your observed seismic data, we can use the energy index scale to estimate a seismic energy from a particular seismic potency. So I know this might be quite complicated, and it will probably make more sense if I show you the energy index curves, but these two parameters doesn't affect the algorithm. It just allows you to convert seismic potency and estimate a seismic energy to get local magnitude. So I'll just jump in and say, okay. So now it's doing all those clustering stages, and it's done. In my seismic dataset plugin, it's created this modeled events a seismic data set. So let's turn our plasticity back off. Actually, I'll just turn it off here. And turn on my seismic events. So there I've got seismic events currently colored by time. That represents the different mining steps. I've got 19,000 events in this case. I'll just bump up. I did show you 2 days ago this value where you can look at all of those in terms of spheres. You can look at them in terms of focal mechanisms as well. So that's my focal mechanisms. You can look at principal axes of these focal mechanisms. So these are all visual. So as I mentioned, the first metric is we want to compare the location of model seismic events and observed seismic events. So that's where my observed seismicity was. That's where my model events occurred. I can already see this is not a good calibration. All the model events are closely wrapped around my cave, whereas I observed quite a few seismic events out here. So the question is, how can I actually get my plasticity to be here in this area where I observed most of my seismicity? Well, first of all, I need to go and investigate what is the root cause of these events. So I'll maybe turn on nodal planes for those events. Apologies, wrong one. So let's look at the nodal planes. Do I see some structures in that area? Yes, I can actually see some alignment there. So there should theoretically be a structure that I include there, which is not currently in the model. Do I see some other structures? Not necessarily. Let's look at our different lithologies. Let's see domain 1. Oh yes, look at that. These events actually correlate quite well with one of my domain boundaries. So maybe I should actually add some interface between my different domains, maybe not domain 2, 3. So I should maybe add an interface here, because it looks like there's actually slip on this domain here. So there's already one way that I use seismic data to, just purely based on location, to try and insert some mechanism into my model from observation such that I can get a good calibration. We can see purely based on location that this is not a good calibration. But I'm going to pretend that the locations match. I've inserted structures into my model. I'm running it. I've run it a second time. I've added the interfaces on the boundary of that domain, and now my events moved. I'm going to pretend they moved closer to where my observations are. The second thing, metric that we want to use is the size distribution plot. So I'm creating a new chart for my size distribution. I'll call this maybe metric 2. And I'll look at the distribution of my mine seismic data set. Actually, I've got a filter applied, so let's turn off the filter. That's better. This looks more familiar. For a potency frequency distribution of magnitude. And then I will do the same thing, turn my model events on. And this is the distribution of the seismic events for my model events. This is not great. So I can see that from observations, I've got, first of all, larger seismic events that I observed than currently what my model is producing. And secondly, the slopes don't match. Well, it's not a too bad match. The B value represents the slope, the steepness of the slope that's fit with the data. So the mine data set has a slope of 0.6 and the model data set has a slope of 0.7, which is not too bad. So I need to get my model to produce larger seismic events. And I actually just want to decrease the slope by a little bit. So again, to do that, as I mentioned, you can go ahead, extract seismic events. I used 0.7 previously, or I actually can't remember, 0.7. Let's try 0.6 in this case, data set 2. And I'm not going to use 10% of my potency. Let's say I'm going to use 50% of my potency. This case. Now, if I turn on my second distribution, now I've overestimated it quite significantly. So you can see I've fiddled with parameters. I've changed the slope, but I've got now way too many large seismic events. So I can go ahead, extract events again, try and play with some different parameters for similarity and potency scale. So 0.5 was obviously too much. There's too much seismic potency in the model data set. But once you've got a good correlation there, we're going to jump ahead, go to the third metric, use a time plot. And let me just hide what I had showed previously. I had 4 pillars, sigma 1 and 4. Actually, let me just do this. I'm going to create a new time plot. Call it metric 3. And look at my minus data set, cumulative potency. Then look at my modeled data set, first model data set, cumulative potency. It's just loading all of that data. Yep, so I can already see here for this data set, just call this my model 1 data set. Just hide seismic events. And then lastly, if I turn on my new data set, cumulative potency. So remember, I underestimated the potency for my first model, now way overestimated the potency for the second model. So I need to scale it down. So that's metric number 3. And then finally, metric number 4. This is my steer, or metric 4. And what I'm going to do is I might just select one area. I'm going to create a spatial filter for the events in this area. So I'm going to see what my box, actually I'll use those events, the spatial filter here. Filter my mine data set with this spatial filter, and I will filter my model data set with the same. So I'm going to copy my filter to just this modeled events A, and I'm going to apply that as well. So I look at my model event, and that's those events. If I now turn on a steering plot for my principal axis, you see this is from the directions of the p-axis of the events in that area. So viewing it in terms of contours. If I do the same for the p-axis of my modeled events, this is what the principal axis. This is not an ideal match, although the orientation matches still northeast southwest, but there's some slight dip to mine. It's actually not too bad. So I've got a fairly good correlation between the principal axis or the pressure axis, and you can do the same for the b axis and the t axis of your modeled and observed events.